I almost didn't go that night. The monthly dinners at my parents' house had long since turned into rituals of comparison. But something in me still obeyed the habit of showing up. My name is Laura Mitchell, and I was 32 years old when this particular evening began. I parked at the edge of the long driveway, looking at the warm lights in the windows. Inside, my mother would already be fussing over the table settings, my father straightening his tie as if preparing for an audience, and my brother rehearsing the story of his latest business triumph. I smoothed down the plain black sweater I had chosen, knowing it made me blend into the background. That was the point. In my family, I had never been the star. The smell of roasted meat and garlic rolls met me at the door. Linda Mitchell, my mother, smiled in that careful way she had, quick to scan my clothes before leaning in for a brief embrace. "Laura, you look comfortable," she said, her voice trailing into the air like a faint perfume. Behind her, I could hear my father laughing with his friends from the Rotary Club. Robert Mitchell had a booming voice meant for small crowds, and he enjoyed nothing more than an evening where his words carried weight. He had always believed in the strength of his 30 years running a local construction firm, and he wanted everyone else to believe in it too. At the far end of the table sat David Mitchell, my older brother. He was already speaking, his tone polished, his suit gleaming under the chandelier. Just 2 weeks earlier, David's software company had gone public, valued at $2 billion. My parents had told that story to anyone who would listen, and tonight was no exception. "It could have been higher," David was saying as I slipped into my chair. "But the market's been tough." The guests nodded, impressed, as my father filled their glasses with wine. I reached for the water pitcher. Unnoticed, my mother gestured toward me briefly, then turned back to her guests. "And this is Laura," she said. "She's been working on a little tech project for some years now, very persistent." The word hung in the air like a consolation prize. Persistent. Not successful, not accomplished, just stubborn. The guests smiled politely, then quickly returned their attention to David, who was describing the challenges of running a large team. I folded my napkin, smoothing the fabric carefully as the conversation swirled past me. The silverware glinted under the light. The gravy boat sat in the center of the table, and the voices rose and fell around me as if I weren't there at all. I wondered, as I had many times before, how long someone could sit quietly while everyone else spoke as if you didn't exist. The dinner moved forward with the rhythm I had known since childhood. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass as he bragged about David's recent IPO. "It's a proud moment for the Mitchell name," he said, his eyes shining. $2 billion. Not many families can say their son achieved that. The guests murmured in agreement. My mother's smile widened, and she reached across to pat David's arm as if he were the only reason the table had been set. I tried to add a thought about the shifts in the tech market, something that might have mattered to the conversation, but Linda spoke right over me. "David has always been the bright one," she said quickly, her voice carrying. "Even when he was young, he had that spark." She turned to the guest beside her, recounting the story of his first science fair ribbon, as if nothing else in the world mattered. I closed my mouth, the words slipping away like steam from a dish left uncovered. The pattern repeated itself throughout the meal. Every anecdote circled back to David, his leadership, his business instincts, his supposed brilliance. I watched him bask in the attention, leaning back with the confidence of someone who had never had to fight to be heard. When I shifted in my chair, Robert caught my movement and added, almost as an afterthought, "And Laura's still working on her company. A small project, but she keeps at it." He smiled as though persistence was the only quality worth mentioning, then moved the conversation straight back to David's vision. The air grew heavier with every passing minute. Forks scraped against plates, glasses clinked, and laughter rose like a tide that had no space for me in its current. I sat there, my hands resting on the napkin folded across my lap, wondering what it would take for them to truly see me. Was silence the only way they remembered me? Quiet, agreeable, conveniently forgettable? I caught David's glance, his smirk faint but clear, and knew the answer had always been the same. Robert set his fork down with the kind of deliberation that always meant he wanted the room's attention. His voice lowered, but it carried easily across the table. "Laura," he began, his tone wrapped in paternal patience, "I think it's time we talked about your little company." The guests quieted, as though sensing something instructive was about to unfold. My mother leaned in, her eyes bright, while David tipped his wineglass just enough to watch me over the rim. "You've been trying long enough," Robert continued, gesturing with his hand as if he were closing an argument. "Let me invest. I can show you how business is really done. 30 years of running my own firm, that's experience you can't buy." His smile was practiced, meant to look generous, but I heard the note beneath it. It wasn't belief, it was control, offered as charity. David chuckled, a low sound that slid under my skin. "She could probably use some real expertise," he added. His words drew another round of polite laughter from the table. I kept my expression still, though the corners of my napkin were twisting tighter in my hands. For years I had learned how to absorb remarks like that, but the sting never dulled. "Thanks, Dad," I said evenly. "But we're doing fine." "Fine for now," Robert corrected, his voice heavy with certainty. "But you'll need guidance if you want to last. Better to accept help before it's too late." His eyes fixed on mine, unblinking, the same way he had looked at me when I was 16 and asked to work summers at his firm. Back then, he had told me to stay out of the way, to let David handle the real work. Some echoes never faded, just then. My phone buzzed against the table, once, twice, then again in quick succession. I tried to ignore it, but the vibrations drew my mother's sigh. "Laura." "At least check your messages," she said, shaking her head. "It might be important." I reached for the phone, already bracing for what I might see. Though a question rose quietly in my chest, what could possibly matter more, in this moment, than the approval I had never been given? The screen lit up with breaking news alerts, the words stacked in bold across the glow of my phone. Arcadia Systems revealed, founder identified as Laura Mitchell. My breath stilled for half a second, then steadied. The very thing I had kept quiet for 5 years was now public, not by choice but by a leak that could no longer be contained. "What is it?" my mother asked, noticing my stillness. Her tone was part curiosity, part disapproval, as if even my silence required correction. "Problems at your little company," before I could answer. The double doors to the dining room opened. Mark Reynolds, my CFO, hurried inside, his suit out of place among the polished dinner jackets. "Ma'am, forgive the interruption," he said, his eyes sweeping over the startled guests before landing on me. "The story has broken. All of it. The Journal, CNBC, the wires, they've identified you as the founder. Your net worth crossed $8.6 billion with the market reaction." The words fell into the room like glass shattering. My mother's silverware slipped from her hand, striking the plate with a sharp clang before sliding to the floor. My father coughed into his wine, sputtering as he tried to regain composure. Across from me, David's face drained of color, his smirk dissolving as if wiped away by an unseen hand. "This has to be a mistake," Robert managed, his voice rough. "No mistake, sir," Mark replied firmly. "Arcadia has been operating in stealth mode for years. Tonight, that anonymity ended. Ms. Mitchell built the company, directed its acquisitions, and positioned it as one of the most powerful players in the market." David's jaw tightened. "Arcadia. That's the company swallowing up half the sector." I looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch until the weight of it forced his eyes down. "Yes, including 3 of your competitors last quarter. I trust the dip in your stock price hasn't gone unnoticed." The table had fallen utterly silent. Even the clink of glasses had stopped, as though the room itself held its breath. My mother stared at me, her lips parting as if to form a word, but none arrived. Her disbelief clung to her like a second skin. "Laura," she whispered, "you said it was just a startup." "No," I corrected softly. "You said that. I just never bothered to correct you." Mark's tablet pinged, the sharp sound breaking the quiet. "CNBC is requesting an interview. The Wall Street Journal too. And Fortune is pushing for a profile by morning." He paused, then added, "Your next call with Singapore is holding as well." "Singapore," Robert repeated, his voice weak. "One of our headquarters." Mark explained, "We're finalizing an infrastructure deal there." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their polite smiles stiff with unease. My father, who had spent decades commanding attention with his voice, now sat muted, his authority stripped in the span of minutes. David's hands clenched around his glass, the tension in his knuckles betraying the quiet panic in his eyes. I folded my napkin, placed it gently on the table, and rose from my chair. The hum of my phone had not stopped, messages stacked endlessly, reminders that the world beyond this dining room was clamoring for me. I looked once at my family, their faces stunned, their pride fractured, and let the truth settle into the silence they had built around me all my life. For a moment, no one moved. The chandelier hummed faintly above us, the sound of its bulbs more present than the people at the table. My father shifted in his chair, his authority suddenly small against the weight of silence. "Laura," he tried again, his voice lowered. "Surely you exaggerate. A few acquisitions. Perhaps. But nothing compared to David's achievement." Mark cleared his throat, glancing down at his tablet. "Sir, Arcadia now holds majority stakes in 7 major firms. Wall Street considers it the most aggressive private technology company in America." I met my father's eyes, steady and calm. "You offered to help me tonight, but the truth is, Dad, your help has never been needed. Not then. Not now." David pushed his chair back with a scrape that seemed louder than it should have been. "You mean to tell us that while we were celebrating my IPO, you were buying up the companies that made it possible?" His tone wavered between disbelief and something sharper. "Fear." "Not just buying them," I replied, my voice even. "Reshaping them. Consolidating where you never thought to look." I leaned slightly forward, not to boast, but to make clear what had been hidden. "The dip in your stock last quarter. That was me. Arcadia set those terms, and will continue to set them." My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. "Laura, how could you keep this from us?" How I echoed, a faint smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. "The same way you kept me invisible, quietly, patiently, until it no longer mattered what you thought." The weight of my words settled over the table. Robert's eyes darted toward his friends, men who had listened to him boast for years, and now avoided his gaze. David sat rigid, his confidence fractured, unable to find the smirk that had always come so easily. I let the silence linger, heavy and undeniable, before I reached for my phone again. The screen lit with more calls, more reminders that the world outside demanded me now not their approval, not their permission. The next morning, I woke to headlines stacked one after another. The Invisible Billionaire. How Laura Mitchell built Arcadia Systems in silence. The company behind the curtain. Each headline carried my name, the same name my parents had dismissed the night before. I sat at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee growing cold, the screen of my phone lighting up again and again. My assistant had filtered the calls overnight, but the tally was still visible. 12 missed calls from my mother, 8 from my father, 3 separate emails from David. Their voices had been absent when I needed them, but now they pressed in with desperate urgency. The phone vibrated again. and I let it roll across the counter, untouched. On the television, a CNBC anchor's voice carried through the quiet apartment. Arcadia Systems is rewriting the landscape of modern technology, and at the center of it all, a woman her own family reportedly described as running a small hobby project. The words were delivered without malice, but they landed with the kind of sting only truth can deliver. A new message appeared, this one from my mother. The country club would love to have you on the board now. They say you'd be a perfect fit. I remembered the rejection letters she had framed as lessons 3 separate times they had declined me, and she had said, "Not everyone is meant for that circle." Laura. Now, the very people who had shut the door were polishing the knob, eager to let me in. I closed the message and opened the acquisition reports Mark had sent overnight. Another deal had cleared, pushing our valuation higher. It was work that mattered, numbers that spoke without bias, far removed from the shifting affections of people who only saw value once it was undeniable. The phone buzzed again. For a moment, I almost reached for it, my hand hovering in the air. But I let it fall back to my lap, a quiet decision settling into me. What was there left to say to people who had only learned my name when the headlines forced them to, by late afternoon? The glass doors of Arcadia's downtown headquarters reflected the fading sun. The building stretched high above the city, its name in steel letters visible from blocks away. I had chosen this office for its clarity. It stood where no one could mistake its presence. Inside, the hum of screens and the low voices of my staff filled the air, a rhythm of purpose that felt steady and alive. When the receptionist called to announce my father, I knew before she finished the sentence, Robert Mitchell had never set foot in my world, not once in all the years I'd been building it, but now he was standing in the lobby asking to see me. I allowed him up. The elevator opened, and he stepped out, his shoulders stiff, his tie loosened, the confidence I remembered muted by something heavier. He paused at the threshold of my office, his eyes caught by the wall of monitors charting global operations, the team of assistants moving with quiet precision. "This is impressive," he said finally, his voice searching for authority. I gestured for him to sit. Before he could begin, Mark Reynolds, my CFO, entered with a tablet. "Laura, we've finalized the deal. Arcadia now controls 40% of the U.S. semiconductor supply." His tone was matter-of-fact, the numbers delivered like weather reports. Robert blinked, trying to process. 40%, he repeated. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. "Laura, about my offer last night, perhaps I underestimated things. I'd like to discuss a partnership, a way I can contribute." I studied him. The man who had told me more times than I could count that persistence wasn't the same as success. "Dad," I said quietly, "I spent more on office furniture last month than your entire company is worth. What exactly would you contribute?" The color drained from his face, but he held his seat, for the first time. I saw hesitation in the man who had once spoken as though his word defined reality. The silence stretched until Mark cleared his throat, reminding me of my next meeting. My father remained in the chair, smaller than I had ever remembered, swallowed whole by the office he had never imagined his daughter would command. The next visitor came less than an hour later. The private elevator doors slid open with a sharp chime, and David Mitchell stepped into my office. He looked nothing like the polished figure from the family dinner. His jacket was wrinkled, his tie loose, and his eyes carried the wild edge of someone who had been awake too long. "Laura, you have to stop this," he said without greeting, his voice cracked, desperation cutting through the air. "My company is unraveling. Investors are panicking. Our stock has lost 30% since last night. You have to help me." I didn't rise. I simply folded my hands on the desk and regarded him with the calm that had always unnerved him. "Help you," I repeated. 5 years ago, You told investors I was playing with a hobby project. You stood in meetings and advised them to stay away from me. Do you remember?" His mouth opened, then closed, the memory flickering in his eyes. "That was different," he muttered. "I was protecting. You were protecting yourself," I finished. "And you succeeded. They turned me down. Every door I knocked on, your voice had already been there, closing it. But you underestimated persistence. David, you underestimated me." He took a step forward, lowering his tone. "We're family. I'm asking as your brother." "Family," I said, my voice quiet but sharp. "Family doesn't sabotage each other's future to preserve their own spotlight. Family doesn't watch one child disappear so another can shine. You want me to rescue you now. When the very ground beneath your company was built on dismissing me, David's hands tightened into fists, though his voice broke again. If Arcadia cuts us off from supply, we won't survive. You know that." I let the silence stretch, long enough for him to feel the weight of it. Behind him, the wall of screens scrolled with market updates, proof of just how little his plea mattered in the larger design. "Then schedule a meeting through proper channels," I said at last. "Arcadia doesn't take family dinners as contracts." His face fell. And for once, David had nothing left to say. By evening, my office had grown quiet. The last of the meetings ended, the screens dimmed slightly, and the city lights began to glow beyond the glass walls. I thought I might finally have a moment to breathe, but the receptionist's voice came through softly. "Your parents are here." Robert and Linda Mitchell entered together, dressed as though they were arriving at a dinner party. Not their daughter's office. My mother's pearls caught the light, but her face looked pale, fragile. My father's shoulders were drawn in, his confidence visibly cracked. They both stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to step further. "Laura," my mother said first, her voice trembling. "We're still family. No matter what has happened, we are still your family." I regarded her in silence. The words were the ones I had waited to hear years ago, but tonight they carried no weight. Family would have believed in me then. I said at last, "Not after the world forced you to." My father cleared his throat. "Searching for ground. We made mistakes," he admitted, though the words dragged slowly from him. "But we can move forward. We can work together, rebuild what was lost." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers resting lightly against the desk. "You didn't lose anything," I replied. "You never saw me as anything worth having. Now that the headlines have changed, suddenly you want to claim me. That isn't family. That's convenience." Linda stepped closer, her hand twisting the strap of her purse. "We were proud of David." "Yes, but we never stopped caring about you." I met her eyes, unblinking. "You cared about the version of me that stayed small, the one you could introduce as persistent, not successful. You never wanted to see who I was becoming, because it didn't fit the story you told yourselves about this family." Mark entered quietly then, a reminder of the world beyond this room. "Laura, the Fortune 500 board is waiting on your line." I stood, smoothing the fabric of my blazer. My parents lingered in the doorway, hope flickering in their faces, but I walked past them toward the conference room. "Some invitations don't come twice," I said softly. The board call ended just as the city sank into night, the skyline marked by scattered lights that seemed to mirror the restless hum inside me. When I stepped out of the conference room, my parents were still waiting in the reception area. They rose quickly as if they hadn't moved at all, their faces lined with the weight of words left unsaid. "Laura," my father began, his tone softer than I had ever heard it. "We were wrong. About everything. But we're here now." Doesn't that count for something I studied him? Remembering every time his certainty had silenced me, every moment he had pointed to David as proof of what success should look like. My mother's eyes searched mine with the same question. her hand trembling slightly as it reached toward me, then fell back to her side. "We are still your family," she whispered. "We always will be." I let the words hang in the air, measured and thin. Once, they might have broken me open, might have been the balm I craved, but now they sounded like an afterthought, a claim staked too late. "Family would have believed when it mattered," I said quietly. "You didn't. You chose not to." Silence stretched between us, beyond the glass walls. Headlights moved across the streets below, each one carrying people home to places where they were wanted. My parents stood in my office, surrounded by the proof of what they had failed to see, and the truth sat heavier than any judgment I could have offered. Robert tried once more, his voice almost pleading. "We can fix this. We can make things right." I shook my head, not unkindly but with finality. You can't fix what you refused to see, and you can't rebuild what you never valued. Mark returned then, holding a tablet with tomorrow's agenda. "Laura, your flight for the West Coast leaves at 7. The Investors' Summit is waiting." His words landed like a closing door. I turned back to my parents, the weight of their expectation pressing against me. "Dinner isn't mandatory anymore," I said softly. No anger, no triumph, just the truth. Then I walked past them toward the private elevator, the echo of my footsteps steady against the marble floor. The doors slid shut, cutting off the side of them standing there, small in the glow of a place they had never believed I could build. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain, no urge to be seen. The silence I carried was enough.